The billionaire in a wheelchair fired every maid. But when Emily arrived, the man who hated noise discovered that even silence could dance, and nothing would ever be the same again. The first thing Emily noticed was the silence. It wasn't the ordinary kind of silence and the kind you welcome after a long day. It was heavy, uncomfortable, a silence that seemed to press the air against her ears. No music, no chatter, no laughter. Only muffled footsteps on expensive rugs and eyes that turned away whenever she tried to introduce herself. The Grant mansion was too big, too white, too cold. The hallways stretched like unkept promises, and the walls smelled of wax, old money, and secrets locked away tight. Still, Emily kept her head high. She needed that job. Her mother had a medical test scheduled, the rent was late, and the electricity bill hung from the fridge's reminder clip like a warning. "Keep your voice down," whispered one of the cooks without even looking at her. "He doesn't like noise." He, Oliver Grant, owner of everything there, including the atmosphere, a billionaire in the tech industry, once the media's golden boy, ex-socialite boyfriend, ex-many things. After the accident that left him in a wheelchair, he vanished from public life. The mansion became a bunker, and the staff began moving like ghosts. Those who talked too much were fired. Those who looked too long were, too. Rumor had it Oliver was cruel, but he didn't yell. His punishment came through silence, or worse, through cold, precise words that cut without ever raising his voice. Emily was briefly introduced to the housekeeper, then to the cleaning team. No one asked where she came from, what she did besides cleaning, or why her eyes seemed to carry something more. She was just another face in the rotation of invisible workers, until the third day. She was polishing the floor of the main hall when she heard the quiet squeak of wheels. She didn't turn around. She kept her rhythm steady, hands firm, shoulders straight. She knew who it was, and she knew he was watching. "You clean like you're dancing," said Oliver from across the room. His voice was low, precise, not a compliment, a provocation. "And you talk like you're judging," she replied without looking at him. Silence. She cursed herself inside. Why answer? Stupid. But Oliver approached. The wheels glided across the floor until they stopped just a few feet away. When Emily finally turned, she met his gaze. His eyes were a dark brown, almost black, impossible to read. He looked her up and down, but not in the filthy way she was used to on crowded trains. His stare was clinical, almost surgical. "What's your name?" "Emily." "A warrior's name." She nodded. The tension between them stretched like a pulled string. "Let's see if you live up to it," he said, pointing at the bucket. Then, as if he had all the time in the world, Oliver rolled back slightly and positioned himself in front of her. "Clean here. Now." He wanted to watch, to see how far she'd go, to test her dignity the way someone tests brakes on a hill. The entire hall seemed to shrink. Emily took the rag, knelt calmly, and began to scrub. Each movement was perfectly measured, not too fast to look eager, not too slow to seem defiant. The floor gleamed, but what Oliver wanted to see was another kind of shine, the gleam of humiliation. But there was none. She cleaned. She stood up, and she met his eyes firmly. "Anything else, sir?" Oliver didn't answer right away. He seemed unsettled, as if unsure where to place that kind of strength coming from someone he'd already decided was weak. "Just don't dance," he finally said, turning and leaving. The phrase echoed in her mind. Emily didn't understand it right away, but she did the next day. She was helping in the kitchen when Eleanor Grant walked in, a presence completely different from her son's. Beautiful, elegant, soft-spoken, but with a gaze that swept the room like a spotlight. "You're Emily?" she asked without preamble. "Yes, ma'am. I saw you cleaning the hall yesterday. Interesting movement. Have you ever danced?" Emily frowned. Only at neighborhood parties. Nothing professional. Eleanor smiled faintly. Even better. And just like that, without explanation, Emily received an envelope at the end of her shift, a formal invitation to participate in the Grant Foundation's charity event as part of the cultural presentation. She was to be the attraction. She would have to dance. When she asked the housekeeper, she was ignored. When she turned to other staff, all she heard was, "Don't argue with Mrs. Eleanor." And it was Natalie, blonde, efficient, clearly used to running things behind the scenes, who delivered the final message. If you refuse, it's goodbye to your job. Simple as that. That night, in the tiny room at the back of the mansion, Emily stared at the ceiling. She didn't cry. She didn't call her mother. She didn't rehearse excuses. She just remembered the afternoons on the rooftop, the loud borrowed speakers, her body free in the flow of improvisation. She remembered the clapping hands that kept the rhythm when there was no music. Dancing was hers. But doing it for them? Becoming a spectacle for the elite to applaud and call it inclusion? That's what hurt. And what she didn't know yet was that someone was waiting for her to fail. Someone who hated music, stages, and everything she represented. Oliver. The first time Eleanor Grant walked into the kitchen, everyone stopped. Not out of fear, but calculation. When the Grant matriarch showed up in places she usually ignored, it meant something big was about to happen. She wore a white linen dress, thin bracelets, and a rich perfume that arrived before she did. Her voice was low, but she didn't need volume. Her power lay in rhythm, in the control of pauses, in the way she looked people in the eye as if she already knew the answer before the question was asked. "Emily, I need to speak with you," she said, as if inviting her for coffee, but it wasn't an invitation. A few eyebrows lifted. Natalie especially bit her lower lip, barely noticeable, but Emily caught it. She followed Eleanor into the office, a classic room furnished with dark wood and the scent of unread books. Eleanor sat down without offering a chair. Emily, having already learned how this world played its games, stayed standing. "Do you know why I asked you to dance at the event?" Eleanor asked, interlacing her fingers. Emily hesitated for a second. "I thought it was an order, not a request." Eleanor laughed softly. Good answer. It was. But it was also a test. Emily kept her eyes steady. She wouldn't ask what kind of test. Eleanor wasn't the type to tolerate curiosity. She revealed things only when she wanted to. The Grant Foundation has held the charity gala for 15 years. It's a masquerade, literally, where the elite pretend to care, throw money at art auctions, and go home feeling humanitarian. Emily raised an eyebrow. Eleanor went on. "In recent years, Oliver hasn't attended. The accident, you understand. But this year, he will be there, and I want, for the first time, something real to happen on that stage." "So I'm the real spectacle?" Emily asked, her tone calm. "No, my dear. You're the truth they don't know how to swallow." Emily swallowed hard. The compliment came laced with venom and purpose. She knew that. But she couldn't quite grasp why Eleanor was betting on her. What did that woman see, and what did she really want? "Rehearse in the main hall. Start tomorrow. And be careful with Natalie. She likes to run the show." Eleanor didn't wait for an answer. Her decision was already made. The next morning, Emily entered the hall early. It was empty, sunlight streaming through the open curtains, glinting off the floor she herself had scrubbed days earlier. She took off her shoes, stepped softly, and danced. There was no mirror, no music, only the memory in her body. Rooftop parties, neighborhood birthdays, bare feet on hard ground, makeshift drum beats. The movement was a wordless prayer. The sound of slow clapping broke the rhythm. Oliver was there. "And here I was thinking Mrs. Grant wanted a grand gala performance," he said with a crooked smile. Emily took a deep breath. Are you spying on me? It's my house. You don't seem very comfortable in it. Oliver moved closer in his chair. His eyes still carried that same unfathomable darkness. But now there was something else. A restrained, uneasy curiosity. You know what's funny? He said. I used to dance here, before the accident. Duets, waltzes, even samba. This room used to have life. Now, it's just a set. She was silent for a moment. Then why do you want to keep it lifeless? He bit his lip, tense. Because you'll be disappointed. You'll try to impress an audience that's already decided who you are. It won't matter if you dance well or not. They'll applaud like they're tossing crumbs, and then they'll forget you. Better that than being remembered for giving up, she shot back. Oliver looked at her, surprised. It was the first time someone had stood up to him, without shouting, without bowing. You're quite full of yourself. No, I'm just tired of lowering my eyes for people who don't deserve it. Silence. Natalie appeared at the doorway, pretending not to listen. But her eyes said everything. She didn't like what she saw. She'd heard enough to notice Oliver's interest. And that changed everything. Need help with the soundtrack? She asked, her sweetness rehearsed. I'll pick my own music, Emily replied. Natalie smiled. Of course, just don't hit the wrong note. The next few days were a mix of tension and rehearsals. Emily danced whenever she could. Oliver watched more often than he should, sometimes in silence, sometimes with sarcasm. Are you really using that step on stage? Looks like a sidewalk improv. Better than looking like a luxury statue, Emily fired back. And so the game went on. One provoked, the other resisted. But in the middle of that war of words, something began to shift. For the first time in a long while, Oliver didn't stay locked in his dark room with the windows closed. He wanted to see, to test, to feel alive. Natalie noticed, and she acted. She began changing small things, delayed rehearsal times, switched out the soundtrack. Once, the speakers simply wouldn't turn on. Another time, the floor was wet, nearly causing a fall. Nothing provable. All accidents. Emily didn't complain. She knew the game. Even in the slums, there were always queens of the party. But Eleanor showed up again. Everything ready for the event? She asked, eyeing the state of the equipment. Almost. A few issues with the sound. Eleanor smirked. Curious. It worked fine before you got here. Emily hesitated. Did Mrs. Grant know? Or was she just another player watching the board? Don't worry. They'll applaud you, Eleanor said. Even if they hate me? Especially if they hate you. What unsettles them stays with them. And she left, leaving Emily alone with the flickering speakers and the question echoing in her mind. That evening, Oliver appeared again, but this time, he didn't tease. He just watched in silence. Will you be there? Emily asked without turning around. Oliver paused. I haven't decided yet. She stopped the music, met his eyes. Decide, because I'll dance, even if it's just for me. Oliver didn't answer, but he stayed longer than he needed to. And when he finally left, Natalie was in the hallway. She saw everything, took note. That night, she made a call. Everything's set for the night of the event. Leave it to me. The Grant Foundation's charity gala was, by definition, flawless. A red carpet at the entrance, crystal chandeliers blazing overhead, waiters in white gloves. The kind of setting where money didn't just circulate, it floated. Emily watched everything from backstage, sitting on a narrow bench. Her body was warm from rehearsing, but her heart was at war. Her dress was simple, dark lilac, thin straps, light fabric, borrowed from one of the housemaids. The only honest thing in that night built like a showroom. On the other side of the curtain, guests sipped French champagne, talked about traffic, the stock market, and the state of the world, with that air of people who believe everything can be fixed with a generous donation and a heartfelt post on social media. Oliver wasn't in the VIP area. He hadn't come down yet. Emily didn't know if he would, or if she wanted him to. "You ready?" Natalie appeared suddenly, all smiles. "Always have been," Emily answered firmly. Natalie stepped closer, adjusting a strap on her dress as if helping, but her voice carried a blade. "Try not to mess up, okay? You're the only one on stage without formal training, but with luck, they'll find it authentic." Emily didn't respond. Natalie smiled, pleased with her own poison, and disappeared down the corridor. Seconds later, the lights in the hall blinked twice. The signal. It was time. The host announced the next performance as though introducing a circus act. And now, a very special presentation by young Emily Ribeiro, representing the very essence of the foundation: inclusion, perseverance, and Brazilian talent. The word inclusion scraped at her ears, almost made her stumble. But she went on. When she stepped onto the stage, the world froze for a second, not because of the beauty of the place, but because of the contrast. She was the only one who looked out of place, off script. The light embraced her. The music began. At first, the soft strum of a guitar. Emily moved gracefully, her feet touching the floor as if she were back on her rooftop at home. Her movements flowed, organic, powerful. The audience didn't quite understand what they were seeing, but they saw something unexpected: truth. She turned, waved her arms, held her breath, and then, at the peak of the choreography, silence. The music was gone, cut off, sudden, brutal. The entire hall murmured. Guests looked around. Some laughed, others checked their phones. A shared discomfort filled the air. In a far corner, Natalie, champagne glass in hand, smiled, discreetly. On stage, Emily froze. 2 seconds, 3, 4, her breathing quickened. The lights still bathed her as if everything were fine. But the sound never came back. She could run, fake a fainting spell, just quit. But then, she closed her eyes and heard a memory. When there's no music, clap your hands. Your body knows the rest. Her mother's voice years ago in the backyard. Emily lifted her head, took one step forward, and clapped, once, twice, 3 times, in rhythm. The sound echoed through the hall like thunder that didn't belong there. The audience went silent. Every eye was on her. And then, she danced. No soundtrack, no backup, just hands, feet, and breath. Raw, intense, beautiful. Her body told a story no microphone could capture. Each step an answer, each gesture a protest. When it ended, sweat covered her forehead, tears hovered in her eyes, and the silence that followed felt eternal. Until the first clap, then another. And suddenly the entire hall was on its feet. Real applause this time. But Emily didn't leave the stage. She turned, scanning the crowd. And then she saw him, Oliver, at the back of the room, in his wheelchair. Still. But his eyes were different. No sarcasm, no judgment, just presence. She stepped down from the stage, walked across the hall as the applause echoed behind her, stopped in front of him, held out her hand. "Come dance with me," she said. Oliver's eyes widened. "Emily, that's not in your way, in the chair. I'll dance with you." The room fell silent again. Everyone watched, not breathing. Oliver hesitated. He was pale. His hands trembled. But then, he took her hand. Emily bowed slightly, gently pulled his chair, guided the movement with her own body, a spin, a glide, a turn, and the audience, hypnotized, began to clap once more. It was symbolic, yes, but real. He danced, with her, in his own way. When it ended, Oliver bowed his head, speechless. Tears glimmered in his eyes, the kind of tears that came from a man finally breaking open from the inside. Emily squeezed his hand. "It's over," she said softly. The silence. Then she walked backstage. At the side of the stage, Natalie crushed the stem of her champagne glass between her fingers, her smile gone. In the audience, Eleanor watched with folded arms. But there was a spark in her eyes, like someone finally seeing a piece on the board move exactly as planned. And Oliver didn't move for several minutes, but when he finally left the hall, he was different. The wall had cracked, and the music, now, was inside him. Oliver vanished. After the event, he disappeared inside his own house, which for him wasn't unusual. But something felt different this time. The wheels of his chair no longer crossed the hall. The bedroom door stayed locked. No sound, no message, nothing. Emily spent the next few days in silence, not out of fear, but out of doubt. Did I go too far? Did he feel exposed? Am I going to be fired? Each question sat in her stomach like a stone. In the kitchen, the staff whispered. Some said Oliver was depressed, others claimed he had left town. Eleanor, as always, knew more than she said, but revealed nothing. Natalie, on the other hand, reappeared with a painted-on smile and a forced calm, haunting the corridors as if waiting for the world to return to normal. But normal had changed. On the afternoon of the fourth day, Emily was called to Eleanor's office. Her heart raced. She entered with her chin high, but her hands cold. Eleanor watched her with a softer look than usual. "Do you think you danced well?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of tea. Emily thought about it. Not about technique, but about impact. "I don't know if it was beautiful," she said, "but it was real." Eleanor nodded. "That's more than most professional artists ever achieve. You have something that can't be taught." She paused, then pulled a folder from her desk drawer. "We've been investigating your background since the day you arrived. And yes, before you ask, it's invasive, but necessary. My son doesn't trust anyone, and I haven't trusted his instincts since he fell in love with the wrong woman." Emily frowned. "Lauren?" Eleanor gave a tight smile. "A sweet poison. When Oliver lost the use of his legs, she lost interest, walked out of his life without looking back. Since then, he's hidden himself away and treated everyone like a threat." "And me?" "You were the first person to touch him without pity." Emily said nothing. She felt the weight of that truth, but didn't know what to do with it. Eleanor pushed the folder toward her. "Oliver will call for you. When he does, be ready and accept what he offers. He doesn't do things out of charity. He does them because he believes in you." The next morning, the call came. Emily entered Oliver's room for the first time. It was large, elegant, and lifeless. Curtains closed, air conditioning too cold. Shelves so neatly arranged it looked like no one had touched them in months. Oliver was turned toward the window. He didn't move when she entered. "I thought you weren't going to call me," Emily said, breaking the silence. "I thought the same," he replied. He turned slowly. His eyes were ringed with exhaustion, his beard unshaven. But his gaze, it was different, less guarded. "I needed a few days," he said. "After what happened, I felt naked. And now," he gave a half smile, humorless. "Now I'm trying to understand what's left." Silence. Oliver rolled closer, stopping just a few feet away. They faced each other. He took a deep breath. "I used to dance." Emily nodded. She'd guessed as much. "I started at 12. My father thought it was a waste of time. My mother paid for lessons in secret: ballet, tap, jazz, samba. My body was my place. my refuge. He went quiet for a moment, eyes shining. When I had the accident, I lost more than my legs. I lost who I was. What was left was money, anger, and silence. And now? She asked softly. Now I see the body changes. But the will, it's still here. Oliver held out an envelope. This is for you. Enrollment paid at one of the best dance academies in the city. I spoke with the director. She'll evaluate you, and if you pass, you'll have a full scholarship. I'll cover the costs. Emily didn't take the envelope right away. Why? Oliver swallowed hard. Because you reminded me what it feels like to be alive. She looked at him steadily. And you think that redeems you? He lowered his eyes. No, but it's a start. She took the envelope, slipped it into her bag. All right, she said quietly. Then let's start. Natalie couldn't stand it. When she learned about the scholarship, the sponsorship, and their growing closeness, she snapped. She tried to accuse Emily of manipulation, tried to regain her old control, but Eleanor was faster, much faster. I already know about the sound sabotage, Eleanor said evenly, and the phone call you made 2 days before the event. Natalie went pale. No need to explain. You're fired. And for the record, I've already contacted the sponsors you used to flatter. Your reputation's gone. You can leave through the back door. That's where people like you belong. Natalie left without a word. No glance at Emily, no defense, nothing. In the days that followed, Emily began the selection process at the academy. She was watched with suspicion by students, by instructors who saw no formal training in her movements. But she passed, easily, and the director's note on her evaluation read simply, "Has what can't be taught." Oliver started leaving his room, not much, but little by little. He watched rehearsals, sometimes offered technical advice. Other times, he just observed, silent, but present. Finally, Eleanor made an announcement that changed everything. We're creating a scholarship program within the foundation for underprivileged youth who want to dance, and we'll name it after our first recipient, you. Emily smiled, and for the first time, she felt she wasn't just changing her life, she was opening a path. Oliver watched from a distance, in silence, but with light in his eyes. He was still afraid, still doubted his worth, still sometimes ran from his own reflection. But that night, before falling asleep, he looked up at the dark ceiling and whispered, "Thank you, Emily." And for the first time, the darkness of his room felt smaller. The studio floor was too smooth. Emily noticed it on her very first day of class. No cracks, no uneven concrete, no scuffed shoe marks. It was so perfect it felt fake. Like dancing there required not just skill, but pedigree. The looks from the other students said it all. They scanned her from head to toe, openly. They saw her posture, her improvised steps, the unease of someone who hadn't grown up in elite studios. To them, Emily was a late beginner, a foreign body. "You're the scholarship girl, right?" one of them asked in the locker room, her voice dipped in polite venom. "I am," Emily replied, tying up her hair. "And you are?" The girl didn't answer. She just turned and left. The first few days were brutal, corrected more harshly, watched more skeptically. Her technique was still forming, but her passion, her commitment, that couldn't be taught. And that's what saved her. By the second week, the contemporary dance instructor pulled her aside. "You have something rare," he said. "It's not pretty. It's necessary." It was the first thing that made sense in that place. While Emily fought to belong in a world she was never invited into, Oliver was fighting his own battle against his body. Intensive physical therapy had begun in a quiet clinic, far from the mansion. He insisted on it. No pitying looks, no cameras, no people pretending to care. "It's just an experiment," he told the therapist. "If I fall, that's it." And he did fall. On the second day, trying to stand with assistance, his body betrayed him. His legs shook, his arms failed to hold him, and he collapsed to the floor like a marionette with its strings cut. The impact wasn't just physical, it was humiliating. The therapist reached out a hand, but Oliver dragged himself back to the chair alone. "Enough," he said between breaths. "We're done for today." But it wasn't over. That same night, Emily showed up at the clinic, unannounced. "Eleanor told me where you were," she said, stepping inside. Oliver turned his face away. "Came to watch the failure show?" "No, I came because I know exactly what it's like to feel like a body that doesn't belong." Oliver exhaled. "You're dancing at the best studio in the city. You're winning. And yet, they look at me like I'm a fraud. They don't say it, but they think it. She's here out of charity, not talent. It's the same look you get when you enter a room full of people who can stand." Oliver said nothing. She was right. "If you stop, I stop," she said, serious. Oliver looked at her, annoyed. "Is that emotional blackmail?" "No, partnership." He smiled, for the first time in days. "So, we fall together?" "We fall, get up, and if we can, we dance." Over the next few weeks, their routines became parallel and intertwined. Emily woke early, trained hard, struggled, improved. Oliver went to the clinic, faced his demons, endured the skeptical looks of therapists. Sometimes they texted. Other times, they simply looked at each other over video calls, saying nothing, yet understanding everything. Until one day, Eleanor invited Oliver to visit the Municipal Theater. The foundation was hosting a technical tour to explore the venue for its upcoming gala, the first of the new institute they were building. He hesitated, but went. Stepping inside was like entering a temple. He remembered the smell backstage, the creak of the floorboards, the echo of breath during a performance, and now he was there again. Seated. Still. Then he heard familiar footsteps. Emily appeared on stage for a rehearsal test, alone, hair tied back, light clothes. No music, only the watchful eyes of teachers evaluating her technique, grace, presence. She danced as if being judged by gods, and still, as if she owed them nothing. Oliver watched silently. Her body wasn't trained like the others, but it was free, strong, alive. He leaned forward unconsciously in his chair. When she finished, breathless, his eyes were still locked on her. Emily came down from the stage and walked up to him. "So?" she asked. "Did I survive the temple?" Oliver didn't answer right away. His eyes shimmered, and then he did the unthinkable. He reached for the crutches beside his chair, the ones he'd been using in therapy, and stood up, slowly, trembling. But he stood. The few people in the theater turned, stunned. Emily held her breath. Oliver took a deep breath and applauded, standing, in pain, but standing. Emily stepped closer, her eyes glistening. "I thought you'd fall," she whispered. "If I had, you'd have been there to lift me." Oliver smiled, lighter than he had in years. "I guess I'm still a body in motion." "We both are." On the drive home, neither of them spoke, but something had changed. The city outside rushed by, cold, hurried, indifferent. But inside that car, in their shared silence, something was growing. Something between hope and discovery. Two bodies that didn't fit the mold, two displaced hearts. Two stories intertwined, not through pain, but through the choice to keep moving. And now, the world was beginning to notice. At the school, Emily started being seen, invited, talked about. Oliver got a call from the foundation's artistic director. They wanted him back as a curator. His name, her name, were beginning to appear together. Maybe they were just symbols, maybe something more. But the stage was set, and the final act was drawing near. The backstage of the municipal theater seemed to breathe with her. Emily could hear the footsteps of other dancers, the whispers of the crew, the muffled murmur of the audience filling the golden rows of seats. Her heart raced, but her body was calm. For the first time, she knew she belonged there, not because she'd been allowed in, but because she'd built her own bridge to get there. She wore her costume for the final performance. Simple, clean. The color of earth, like the rooftop where it had all begun. In the mirror, her eyes were steady, hair tightly pulled back, body ready, waiting. Someone spoke through the radio. 5 minutes. She took a deep breath. Beyond the curtain, the audience settled. Journalists, politicians, business people, and them. In the first row, 20 young students, simple clothes, quiet smiles. Most had never set foot in a theater before. Some looked like they weren't even touching the floor, as if afraid it wasn't real. They were the first scholarship students of the new institute. Oliver sat just behind them, between Eleanor and the theater's artistic director. He wore a dark suit, crutches resting beside the chair, and an expression he hadn't worn in years, the look of a whole man. The event began with a video about the creation of the Emily Ribeiro Institute, narrated by Eleanor, showing backstage footage and pieces of Emily's journey. The audience watched in silence, absorbing the story of a woman who had turned her own life into art. When the curtain rose, she stepped on stage, alone, white light, empty set, total silence. Emily clapped her hands once and began. The choreography was hers, built from her own story. It started with hesitation. Her body curved, feet sliding cautiously as if testing the ground. Then came resistance, the struggle, the sharp movements, the heavy turns. In the middle, silence. Literal silence. She stopped, listened to her own breath, and clapped. Just like that night when the music had failed and she had kept dancing anyway. When it ended, Emily stood center stage, chest heaving, eyes wet, arms open, and the theater erupted. Cheers, applause, whistles, a standing ovation. But one applause made her tremble. Oliver was standing, leaning on his crutches, trembling, smiling, tears in his eyes, face unguarded. Emily saw him. He saw her. No words. None needed. Backstage was chaos. Photographers, crew, important guests. Emily was heading toward the exit when she heard a voice. "You've grown." She turned. Lauren. High heels, expensive dress, the same calculated smile, the same aura of someone who never loses a war, only hides until it's safe to reappear. "I came to support the Institute," Lauren said. "Heard my ex is into charity now." Emily stayed poised. "He's rebuilding, starting over." "And you turned into a star?" "No. I just became who I always was." Lauren stepped closer, trying to reclaim the space. "He still misses me, you know. He's just hurt. But men like Oliver never forget their first great love." Emily took a step forward, calm and steady. "Maybe, but you know what I saw in him that you never did?" "What?" "A real man, even sitting down." Lauren swallowed hard, didn't answer, and left. From the end of the hallway, Oliver had seen everything. He didn't step in, just waited. When Emily reached him, he said, "You're more graceful than I am." I'd have told her off without holding back. "Sometimes grace means letting the other person sink with class," Emily said. They laughed, together. In the main hall, Eleanor stepped onto the stage for the closing speech. "Good evening, everyone," she began. "Tonight, we're not just celebrating a premiere. We're celebrating the birth of a bridge. Between worlds, between classes, between realities. And that bridge has a name. the Emily Ribeiro Institute. The crowd applauded. Eleanor continued. This institute will provide scholarships for young people from the outskirts. Those who, like Emily, have talent but never had opportunity. We'll build community dance centers, bring art into schools, public squares, cultural hubs. We'll take dance where it's never been before. She looked toward the front row. And this was only possible because someone decided to stop running. My son, Oliver. More applause. Oliver didn't go on stage. He didn't need to. For the first time, he accepted the applause. Emily sat beside the young scholarship students. One of them, a little girl with braids, watched with wide, shining eyes. You danced without music, she whispered. Emily smiled. When the music stops, we make our own. Want to learn? The girl nodded. Emily stood, clapped once. The girl copied her. Another clap, stronger. Soon they were both dancing there in the corner of the theater, their palms keeping rhythm. Other children joined in, clapping too. Oliver watched, in silence, but full. Later that night, outside the theater, Oliver and Emily walked together through the back entrance. He with his crutches. She still glowing from the performance. Still hurts? She asked. Every day. And do you still think it's not worth it? Oliver stopped, looked at the sky. It is, because it's not just for me. Not for me either, she said. They looked at each other. No kiss, no declaration, but something deeper than romance, complicity, choice, real transformation. Oliver held out his hand. Emily took it. And now? He asked. Now we dance with the others. And they walked on. A man who'd started living again, a woman who never stopped fighting, and a bridge built from art, courage, and the sound of hands clapping in silence. And you? What did you think of this story? Tell me, when the music stops, who claps for you? Write that person's name in the comments. If this story touched you, help keep the bridge alive, leave a like and subscribe to help this dance go even further.